Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Jonathan Derbyshire, and I'm the Executive Opinion Editor of the Financial Times. Let me start with a few technical notes. Should you have technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again. And subtitles are available. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. I'm delighted to host this evening's event, which brings together economist Diane Coyle and journalist Rory Cellan-Jones. And they're going to provide important insights into the impact of the digital economy, which is shaping our present and our future in indelible ways. Each of them is going to talk about their respective books. We'll hear first from Rory, who will discuss his latest book, Always On, Hope and Fear in the Social Smartphone Era. And then from Diane, who'll talk about cogs and monsters, what economics is and what it should be. We'll then bring them together for a conversation with me and take questions from you, which you can post in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout. But before I hand over to Rory and Diane, let me give a quick introduction to them both, though I'm sure, as the saying goes, they need no introduction. Diane Coyle is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She directs the Bennett Institute, where she heads research under the themes of progress and productivity. She's also a director of the Productivity Institute, a fellow of the Office for National Statistics, an expert advisor to the National Infrastructure Commission, and senior independent member of the ESRC Council. And she was awarded a CBE for her contribution to the public understanding of economics in 2018. Rory Cellan-Jones was a reporter for the BBC for 30 years, covering business and technology stories for much of that time. In 2001, his first book, Dot Bomb, a critically acclaimed account of Britain's dot-com bubble, was published. Since leaving the BBC, Rory has become an independent technology consultant, writer, and broadcaster. He's been investigating in particular the role technology can play in improving the treatment of Parkinson's disease, having been diagnosed with the condition in 2019. And if you didn't know already, Rory and Diane are husband and wife, though they tell me this is their first joint event. So I'm delighted to be the midwife, as it were. Rory, can I ask you to speak first, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I've just set a timer of 10 minutes so that I don't go over. So tonight, we're talking about two books. One, a very serious analysis of the profound changes wrought by technology on how we need to think about the economy. And the other, a racy, somewhat gossipy, if entertaining account of the same events. But you'll hear from Diane about the latter, Cogs and Monsters, in a moment. But seriously, my book is really a work of journalism, hers a work of scholarly analysis. I've been lucky enough to have a great job from 2007, although I've really been doing it before, which gave me an insight into an extraordinary period, which is what the book covers, what I'm sort of describing as the social smartphone era. It began, my first real story in that period was to see Steve Jobs unveiling the iPhone in San Francisco in January 2007. And when you think a whole bunch of things came together in those few years, in 2004, Facebook was launched. 2005, YouTube first came to our notice. 2006, Twitter was launched, and then 2007, the iPhone was unveiled at that extraordinary event, extraordinary performance from technology's master storyteller, Steve Jobs. And together, they formed an extremely powerful force. So very smart computers, which we all began carrying around. The iPhone was by no means the first smartphone, but it was the one that introduced us to the idea that phones were about carrying information around with us, about carrying the internet around with us, and all that implied, coupled with these increasingly powerful social networks, in particular Facebook. And the book looks at what happened over the ensuing 14 years and the profound changes those different forces combined to bring. if you think really, first of all, about just the mobile phone industry, there's a graphic I sometimes put out of profits in the mobile phone industry between 2007 and 2011, and how extraordinarily rapid the disruption caused by Apple's iPhone was. At the beginning of that period, a huge chunk of the profits went to Nokia, which had 40% of the entire mobile phone market at that time. More to Samsung, a little slice to Samsung, companies like Sony, BlackBerry, of course, research in motion, pretty powerful and seen as the desirable must-have smartphone device back then. By 2011, complete transformation. Just about everybody was losing money, apart from Apple, which had 80% of the entire profits, which were much bigger, of course, of this much expanded industry, and Samsung still doing reasonably well. And the likes of Nokia and BlackBerry were on their way out, complete rapid transformation. So that was one immediate impact. But of course, it went far beyond that. All sorts of areas of our lives transformed, not just by the phones, but by their use with social networks, by the transformation in all sorts of industries, from shopping to dating to travel. It was a breathless period. And the book really has a story arc. The first section is extraordinarily optimistic. It's the hope of the hope and fear of the social smartphone era. And it wasn't just smartphones. It was the arrival of other smart devices in our homes, eventually tablet computers, smart speakers, smart thermostats, and so on. And the recognition that artificial intelligence, AI, was coming out of its winter and was beginning to show that huge advances were being made that would, again, promise to transform just about every industry and all sorts of areas of our lives. And I think that optimism sort of peaked in around 2012 at the London Olympics, when Tim Berners-Lee sat on the stage at the opening ceremony of the London Olympics and said, "This is for everyone," said a tweet around the stadium saying, "This is for everyone." And that kind of summed up that mood of optimism that, technology was a good thing. It was an exciting thing. It was a stimulating thing. It was bringing all sorts of improvements to our lives. The second section is a bit of a downer, where we look at the downsides of this revolution, the fear. And it features interviews with, again, Tim Berners-Lee, who I've spoken to over the last 20 years at various stages. And what was really striking to me was that by 2019, this man who had seen nothing really negative in his creation, the World Wide Web, and had said to me at one point, "I don't know why people complain about all these bad things on the web. I have a great experience. I mix with other scientists. I have a stimulating exchange. It's an open, creative place." His view of it had darkened, and he gave a great quote, which was that he thought he could ignore all the bad forces, all the bad influences on the internet, and then suddenly he realized these people vote, and their votes were taking the world in a direction he didn't like, and he summed up our fears, I suppose, about social media. So we go into some detail into how our view, particularly of Facebook, changed during that period, particularly after 2016, and how the leaders of those companies had to begin to face up to their responsibilities, although I still feel they haven't. The other thing we come to grips with is our increasing obsession with these devices, the always-onness of them, how much of our lives they're taking up, and whether that is an entirely good thing. I remain an optimist. I speak to people in the book who are very down on this connectivity and what it's done to our lives, I retain a measure of optimism, but sometimes it's difficult. And then the third section of the book, which was written up here during the pandemic, which emerged as I was some way into the book, kind of brings those two themes together, because the pandemic somehow highlighted everything that was good and interesting and transformative about the technology, and everything that was bad. So it helped us survive. It helped us talk to our grandchildren across the other side of town, in Diane and my case. It helped us shop. It helped us school our kids. But the technology also was incredibly powerful in spreading lies, in spreading misinformation, in spreading discord. So I bring all those together, and I try to end with a message of hope when it comes to one area of the smartphone revolution that I think has still some way to go. Whenever people ask me what's next in technology, I say the smartphone revolution continues and is still affecting more areas of our lives. And that area is health, a particular interest of mine. I've got some optimism that a lot of the promise, a lot of the hype that there's been, perhaps excessive hype, about the combination of artificial intelligence and these sensor-packed devices will transform healthcare in all sorts of ways, whether that be wearable monitors or of delivering better care for people with Parkinson's, measuring their symptoms more effectively, or artificial intelligence helping cut the time it takes to develop new drugs. So there is a message of revolution at the end. But the book also ends up with one mystery, which is this was a period of extraordinary innovation, of extraordinary rapid change, apparently affecting every area of our lives. But where is it not visible? In the productivity figures. The last 15 years, the smartphone revolution have seen productivity, certainly in this country, flatline, and the economy generally not leap ahead in the way in which, say, the domestic appliance revolution of the 90s and 1950s and 60s certainly did. So that is a major mystery, and it's one which I turn to the person who knows far more about these issues than me, which is my dear wife, Diane Coyle.
Thank you very much, Rory, for that very vivid presentation, which I think ran from optimism to despair to uncertainty. It remains to be seen whether our own conversation will follow the same narrative arc. But Diane, maybe you can take up the baton.
Indeed, and thank you for that very smooth handover, Rory. So I'm speaking to you from a hotel room, and I'm looming at an unusual angle because I don't have the usual pile of economics textbooks to prop my laptop up on. But it would have been a bit weird if Rory and I had been sitting side by side in front of the same screen. I noticed he was wearing his T-shirt. I was into data before it was big, when I am the one of us that knows how to handle data. And I think he got that T-shirt at a conference where he was Mr. Diane Coyle. But anyway, I'll let that pass. My book is about economics, really, and it's broader than the digital questions alone, but that's what I'm going to focus on this evening. And I was trying to remember when both Rory and I got interested in the digital economy. My first book about it came out in 1997. It was called The Weightless World. So that's 25 years ago. But Rory was also the BBC's technology correspondent during that first dot-com boom. And in fact, he was appointed on a day when I said to him, this is going to mark the top of the market for sure. And indeed, it was the peak of the NASDAQ in that first boom. So it's been quite a roller coaster. But one of the points Rory ended with there was the way that it's invisible in the productivity figures. And in fact, it's invisible in the economic statistics altogether. So quite a lot of my research now is trying to figure out what we should be measuring to understand what the digital economy is doing to our lives, what the technology is doing to our lives, because we spend an average of 28 hours a week online in the UK. In our household, that's divided rather unevenly between me and Rory, I should say. But that's a day a week, more than a day a week. So that's a lot. And companies have completely reformulated their business models, platform models, everything. And digital markets have been transformed. And so the first challenge is actually, can we even measure what's going on? What are the right statistics to use? But the other issue that I've been really interested in is this a good or a bad thing for the economy? We could think about it in terms of productivity, and it isn't showing up in the figures. This has happened twice now. It happened in the 1980s when the computer revolution first rolled out, and it took a good decade or a decade and a half for that to start showing up in productivity. If you look into the detail of what's happening at the level of individual businesses now, the companies that know how to use data, digital technologies, are seeing their productivity increase, but they're a minority. They're pulling further and further ahead of the rest. And markets in which they operate are getting more concentrated. There's more monopoly power, market power. So a couple of years ago, I was on a panel chaired by Jason Furman, a very eminent US economist, looking at digital markets in the UK and how to think about how to make those markets work better. How could we make competition work better? And the challenge they pose for regulators like the Competition and Markets Authority and their equivalents in other countries is that digital markets are what's called winner takes all. They always have a dominant player. And the reason for that is twofold. It's partly economies of scale. And there are lots of sectors of the economy where that's true. If you think about manufacturing airplanes, there are two companies that do that at scale. Or manufacturing cars, there aren't very many car manufacturers. In digital, it's things like investing in data centers, and only the handful of big tech companies do that at large scale, or creating very complex software and algorithms and machine learning systems. And again, the big tech companies dominate that. All of that takes an awful lot of time and money. So the economies of scale are very large. But that's not new. We've had that in the economy before. But they also have, and I'm going to throw the first bit of economics jargon at you, what are called network effects, and indeed indirect network effects. And what that means is that the more people are using the service, the better it is for everybody who's already using the service. So think about a telephone network, you need somebody to call. Or if you think about a platform for booking a reservation in a restaurant, the restaurants want to know there are lots of customers using the platform, and the customers want to know there are lots of restaurants to choose from. And so there's this kind of chicken and egg problem. And a lot of platforms lose money and then just go kaput. And the ones that have investors that are rich enough that they can sustain the losses become the winner in the market. They dominate the market. And once they get to a certain tipping point, that's the moment at which they become the winner who takes all. So these are not like standard markets when you're thinking about competition. Normally you'd think about, well, what can customers substitute to? Who else can come into the market? And think about competition at any given moment. In these markets, we need to think, well, Facebook took over from MySpace, can somebody now take over from Facebook? Or Google is better than Yahoo, and now 98% of people use Google as their search engine. Could anybody else knock them off their perch and become the same thing? So thinking about competition policy becomes quite challenging. In the Furman Review, we recommended a series of measures which the government, when it's got its mind on things that are not in the news headlines every day, might get around to legislating Digital Markets Unit. But the other aspect that I talk a lot about in the book about these kinds of markets is that they are not like markets for apples or handbags or shoes, in the sense that they're public goods in the very technical economic sense. And let me explain what that means. Public goods like parks or clean air, they're not used up. If I use Google search or use a data set, that doesn't deplete it. Somebody else can use it too. There's no limit to the number of users, and it doesn't get used up. And data is a really good example. People often say data is the new oil. It's not at all like oil because many people can use it at the same time. Whereas if I put petrol in my car, you can't use it in your car. And what this means for economic policy is that we can't presume that markets will be the best way to organise the economy. On the contrary, there are well-known problems about public goods that they always need, as the name suggests, public intervention. And we've seen all kinds of economic effects, but also non-economic effects like online harms that Rory was talking about, that make us think the policy world as a whole, the government, not just competition authorities, need to rethink how we approach these markets. And so what I argue in Cogs and Monsters is for a reframing of the kind of mental model that economists have when they approach policy challenges. And that typical mental model is we have a lot of theories and assumptions that tell us that markets generally organize the economy very well. And we've had the experience of planned economies, knowing that there's evidence to support that assertion. And what policy does is identify specific failures in the market and fix those one by one. And I'm arguing that in the digital economy, that needs reversing, that actually markets don't work very well. And we need to think again about what the framework is for policy, not just economic policy, but more broadly. Because what we have is fantastic in many ways. We all use these devices all the time. I got stuck on a train somewhere in the middle of the Netherlands today, and if I hadn't had an app, heaven knows how I would have been here talking to you this evening. So they're marvelous, but there are also many downsides to them as well. And I think we're only just scratching the surface of what kinds of policies we need to address this properly. So I didn't have a timer, but I think that's about 10 minutes. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diane. A question for both of you, picking up on what Diane has just said. Do you think policymakers are showing any sign of responding to the challenges that Diane has very lucidly set out? I wonder, for instance, what you both make of the new EU Digital Services Act, and whether you think that's an important first step in taming the power of the big technology companies, because as one of the implications of what you said, Diane, is that this is a question as much about power as it is about competition and free markets.
Yeah, I mean, when I started covering this back in the mid-2000s, what was really striking was the sheer arrogance of the technology industry, not just the companies, but of the kind of Californian spirit. There's a I think it's a John Perry Barlow quote about "Don't bring your earthbound rules to this free territory of the internet." There's kind of a spirit of utopian libertarianism, really, and what they eventually were forced to wake up to, the tech giants, was that yeah, you could govern the internet. Look at China; it managed to do it, and obviously that's not a great example to follow. Western countries spent years being incredibly too naive about these companies, and they still veer from kind of rather pathetic veneration of wanting to slap the name Google on any government initiative to knee-jerk sort of ban it. But I think they are feeling their way towards gradually the kind of legislation we're seeing out of Europe, here in the UK, perhaps less impressively, a giant content moderation kind of bill, the online safety bill, which has got all sorts of problems with it. But at least they've come to realize that, you know, there is a job to be done, and there are some countries around the world showing a lead in doing that. I mean, Diane will have a better view on who's doing it best. I
do agree that we've reached a moment where all the major jurisdictions are deciding it's time to tackle the power of the tech companies. And the UK and the CMA have been pioneers, if you like, DMA in Europe, Lina Khan in the United States, forging a path there, and the Chinese interventions as well. So things are definitely changing. I think my concern about it is that policymakers haven't really framed the questions that they need, the problems that they need to tackle in quite the right way. So Rory raised the online harms bill. And that's just really difficult. The scale of what needs to be done is enormous. So one idea I have is that part of the cause of the harms is people clicking on adverts. They're advertising funded business models, and the incentive of all the companies is very much to get people to click. So it's that drive for clicks, that drive for virality is part of the issue, part of the cause. So one idea is a tax on advertising, and Paul Romer, the Nobel laureate, has suggested that. Another idea that I put forward is a different kind of business model to compete with the advertising funded one, which is not subscriptions, but having public service social media, so that just as we have a BBC, that means that commercial broadcasters don't only compete on number of viewers, but also on quality. Maybe that would help competition on quality in the online world as well. I'm not sure if either of these would work, but they're different ways of thinking about it. The other thing that worries me is the way we think about data. And it's just been embedded in law everywhere as a piece of property. So we all click on boxes that in effect are a legal contract that means we hand over the data that companies collect about us. But data is not like apples. It's not like goods. You shouldn't be able to transact it in that way. It's relational. It's my data has information about other people. It's only useful to me when I can join it up with other sources of information. It's it's a social phenomenon, not really a piece of economic property that you ought to be able to transact like that. And nowhere much in policy are people thinking about, should we be changing the legal framework to deal with that?
Can I come in on
yes,
what you said about advertising? I think that is a huge problem, that being the almost exclusive business model for a lot of these companies. And I write a bit about health tech. I spoke to a company recently that is trying, the laudable aim of launching a social network about health for people to share information about health, which is a really vital thing. One of the terrifying things for anybody with long-term health worries is that the internet has provided an awful lot of disinformation as well as good information. And this entrepreneur, I was saying, is a hopeless task. You're not going to take on Facebook because everybody has failed. And he was hoping to do it without advertising and was taking inspiration from the Wikipedia model, which I've talked to Jimmy Wales about. He mentioned it in the book as being a potentially superior model, a kind of a volunteer model where it's self-editing and it's got its problems, but it doesn't have the same problems of abuse to the same extent and disinformation that Facebook does, because the incentives to spread misinformation are not the same when you don't depend on clicks and therefore advertising for your revenue.
It's actually quite a big volunteer community online. You think about open source software, and R and Python overtaking paid for software in my world. And this fascinating phenomenon, particularly in the medical area, of people whose family members or children have a particular issue and they research it and they come up with innovations and they post that for free online for other people. And this is an area where we don't have a good idea of what the scale is, but I think it's quite substantial.
Diane, in your introductory remarks, you suggested that one of the things these distinctive digital markets force us to do is change our mental models. And that applies to economists and policymakers. We need to change the mental models we use to feel our way around markets and questions of competition and so on. Do you think the pandemic, which has seen governments mobilize vast amounts of money and use their power to intervene in markets on an unprecedented scale, has, as it were, opened an opportunity for that sort of rethinking?
That's interesting. It's kind of proof of concept, I suppose, that the government can step into the economy at substantial scale and the sky doesn't fall in. Because we're coming out of 40 years of a sort of public philosophy of markets first, markets best, and retreat of the state. I mean, the state hasn't really retreated in any case. Nowhere has there been a substantial drop in the ratio of government spending to GDP for all kinds of reasons. But that was the rhetoric of it. And so the pandemic was a proof of concept. There's a quote from Gramsci that's become a kind of cliche now, but I think it's very apt that, I'll get it wrong. The old has died, the new is struggling to be born. And I think we're in that period of a kind of contest between two different public philosophies. But you'll know more about that, Jonathan, than we do.
Well, remember that there's another bit of the quote which says, and in the interregnum, all sorts of morbid symptoms appear, and those are the monsters in the title of your book, or what economists would call the externalities caused by these new technologies. Rory, as you made very clear in your introduction, one of the key narrative arcs in your book is the transformation from early optimism to gathering gloom. I mean, our conversation so far seems to have focused on gathering gloom. So can you just help us to remember, maybe going back to 2007 when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, exactly why you felt so optimistic and excited about it? Because as you say in the book, many of your colleagues in technology journalism, business journalism, were much more skeptical than you were. And they said, Rory, this is just another product launch. Why are you getting so excited about the iPhone?
Well, I think, to be fair, quite a few technology journalists were interested. The wider journalism, maybe not. I mean, it was an extraordinary event to be at. So I had been sent to Las Vegas to the ghastly CES annual gadget show the first time I went, and the BBC had sent me in a big team as a kind of marker that, hey, we're really interested in technology. And I had said, I know we're spending a lot of money, but I think we need to break off for a day because there are rumors that Steve Jobs is going to unveil something big, and he's a guy that doesn't like to mix with the hoi polloi of the rest of the technology industry. And so they said, oh, okay, you can have a crew and go for one day. So that it felt like a huge moment. The other thing was, it was a moment in technology in terms of the way we're going to deliver the piece, because we had just started. In the old days, we used to feed from a satellite truck, which cost, you booked a slot, it was 15 minutes and it cost something like $2,000. And we had just started feeding over the internet, which was obviously free, but you didn't tend to do it against a deadline. You used to do it overnight because it could take a long time. So there was a lot of tension because we were, the event was over at 11, which was 7 o'clock at night, and we had to get it on the 10 o'clock news. So that was the other thing. And then the performance itself, I started off feeling incredibly cynical because I hadn't been to what it was effectively a press conference, a giant product launch event. Being a British journalist, I hadn't seen people cheer and clap and holler. And I was oh, please, pull yourselves together. But then I got carried away with it. And it was the all-time great presentation. In fact, I interviewed Tony Fadell last week, who was the Apple creator of the iPod and then led the iPhone production team. And he told me that he had been nervous. He'd been behind the scenes, nervous about it, obviously, but he knew that Steve Jobs was going to pull it off because he'd been telling this story privately for 2 years about this phone. And he wove the story again brilliantly. And I thought this was going to be big because as I came rushing out of the hall trying to think how we're going to feed this piece, I got a call from the news desk who were never interested in these sort of things. And they'd seen early pictures coming out of the phone and they just said, wow, you've got to get your hands on it, which was, an impossible demand. I tell a story in the book about how I did do that. But that told me that this had a certain excitement to it. And I, after we got back, there'd been some complaints to the BBC from people who said, this was just a product launch, why are you covering it on the news? And I was hauled onto a complaints program. And I rather stuck my neck out by saying, well, if the BBC had been around when the Model T Ford was launched, would we have ignored that, or would that have been seen as more than a product launch? It obviously was more than a product launch. It launched the age of automobiles, and maybe this will be the same. And I've made similar bets about other things which have turned out to be rubbish, but that was a good bet because
I think it would be fair to say, this was certainly the impression I got reading the book, that you think that moment in 2007 was every bit as consequential as Tim Berners-Lee inventing the web itself.
Yeah, well, it took the web and made it mobile, which was an incredibly important moment. I mean, as I said earlier, there had been other smartphones. I'd been to Nokia in 2000 and seen these rather wonderful little sort of clamshell typing devices, but they were expensive and clunky and, for nerds. This was for everyone, in Tim Berners-Lee's words. And I suppose somebody else would have done it, but Apple did do it, and everything else followed from that. And not just the phone itself turned out to be a bit rubbish. The first version, it had a very poor camera, very poor connectivity, and so on. And it wasn't until the following year that a better version came out, and crucially, the App Store was launched. Now that was probably the key moment, because the app economy was what turned the phone and the social networks and so on into this extraordinarily powerful force. It
combined other technologies, the 3G and subsequently 4G, so the connectivity and all the advances in mobile technology. Also market design, economists played a part in this because a lot of apps were built on those kinds of ideas. But it was an absolutely key moment, because that 28 hours a week and the invention of new kinds of business models, that all depended on the smartphone. So I agree with Rory. Of course, I always agree with Rory.
Unbelievable.
It was an absolutely key moment.
Lots of questions flooding into the Q&A box, which I'll turn to shortly. But Diane, I just want to ask you about the other bit of the book, and whether you could talk briefly about that, because it's, as you say, the book is divided into two halves. It's about cogs as well as monsters. So it seems to me the book is doing two things. You are offering, in the first instance, a partial defense of the discipline of economics against certain recent criticisms. And then the second bit, which is the bit you introduced us to, you examine the way digital technology transforms the economy, meaning that our analysis of the economy needs to change. But there is a connection between those two strands, isn't there, which is captured in the title. Cogs, which are, as you put it, the self-interested individuals assumed by mainstream economics, and monsters, which are, and I'm quoting you, the socially influenced, untethered phenomena of the digital economy, which is, I guess, where your interests converge with Rory's. I wonder whether I could just ask you to say a bit, though, about the first part of the book, and say something about what have become quite standard criticisms of the shortcomings of mainstream economics, and why you think, at least partially, they miss their target.
Book was born out of exasperation with some of the criticisms you often hear about economists. That we assume that people are rational, but everybody knows everybody's biased, so that must be rubbish, as if nobody had noticed the behavioral economics revolution, or the idea that we use abstract models and mathematics, as if actually all disciplines don't use models. Historians use models. We're all trying to make sense of a complex world by boiling it down to a simpler story, if you like. But there are ways in which economics has to pull its socks up. So the first way is actually the diversity of the economics profession, or rather its lack. We claim to be a social science, and if it's, to use shorthand, posh, white and male, then we're not doing a very good job of asking the right questions or understanding people's lives. The second is the way that we model up and insist that you can separate actually objective analysis of an economic situation and value judgments. And we will often claim that our job is to look at the evidence and come up with the right solution, and the comparisons are made to engineers or plumbers or dentists and by all kinds of eminent economists. and then we leave the value judgments to the politicians. But our assessments of what makes a situation better or not is inherently about value judgments. And so I argue, first of all, that we should stop pretending that you can separate the two so cleanly. But second, that the way the economy is changing and the digital economy means thinking about value judgments much more closely. So to go back to the example I gave of markets that tip and become winner-take-all markets, do we care who the winner is? And we've ended up in a world where the winners are very large Chinese and American companies. Actually, we might care about that. That might be part of our assessment, but it hasn't been part of the way that economists doing policy jobs have thought about markets. And so facing up to these sort of digital phenomena is part of the challenge of being much more upfront about what sorts of value judgments economists make when they say, oh, this is the efficient thing to do, or this will be the best thing to do. Best is inherently about value judgments.
Rory, at the end of your book, you pose a question: how do I see the balance sheet of good and ill for this social smartphone era? What's the readout, roughly? I mean, you ended your introduction by pointing to advances in the sphere of healthcare, which I'm particularly interested in. My son, for example, is a type 1 diabetic and uses an app to...
I've written about that. Yeah. Is it Chou Enlai who said about the French Revolution, it's too early to tell?
He did.
I mean, we are right in the middle of this sort of huge decisive period where we're trying to work out whether we can, wrestle the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons to the floor and make them deliver greater goods. And I worry in particular about the what I've seen. If you think about 2007 and the mobile phone industry, which is an incredibly important industry, and the fact that we had a giant European-based company, Nokia, as a powerful force, and all of that power went to mostly to America and I suppose also to China, a sort of bipolar world. I worry about that. But what I haven't lost is the excitement I've always had about the potential of this technology and the way it's transformed our lives for the better. I come back to simple things like Diane and I being able to FaceTime our granddaughter during the pandemic. The fact that I can increasingly see a world in which my condition, my Parkinson's, will be accurately measured, my medication graded according to day-to-day changes rather than every 6 months when I see a consultant. I do see lots of potential there. I still get a thrill from seeing something new, from seeing I'm the sad sack who wore Google Glass obsessively for 3 months until everybody, including my wife, told me I looked like an idiot, and I believed them. But
didn't you walk into a lamppost, Rory?
I may have walked into a lamppost. That may be true. But I still believe that developments like that will one day improve our lives in all sorts of ways.
Diane, I suppose you're professionally obliged to be a little more pessimistic, or at least skeptical.
Grumpy.
Well, it's a really tough question, Jonathan, because it does take a long time to assess. The internal combustion engine was a great democratizer, and people have loved the mobility they've got from their car, but look at how it's contributed to climate change. I don't know how you do balance those things against each other. I think we're not going to get rid of the tech. So my focus is on the policies and the behaviours that will make it work for us, so that balance, whatever it nets out to be, becomes more favourable.
I will turn to the audience questions soon because there are so many of them and they look so good. But Rory, there was one thing I wanted to pick you up on. You so when you were giving the account of the optimistic half of the book, of the sunny uplands of 2007 and just after, you talked about the end of the artificial intelligence winter, the AI winter. I wondered what you made of the story that emerged last week of the Google engineer who thinks that the AI system he's been working with is actually sentient.
That was a freakish story, and I saw a lot of people that I follow on Twitter and I'm part of a group of sighing at the fact that this was being covered at all, because they thought it was trivial and silly. But it did say something about how we assess what is artificial intelligence. Which is something I really struggle with. I've been looking for definitions for ages. Diane and I both read a book recently about Bletchley Park and its contribution to to D-Day, and in there's mention of the first computer, effectively Colossus, programmable computer, and it uses the term machine learning, which is the great modern AI phenomenon. So I think we do have huge problems in defining these things, but that particular story was just somebody who was obviously just a bit silly, had spent too long talking to chatbots and had let his imagination run away with him.
But didn't it touch on a fairly profound anxiety that we have about the implications of artificial intelligence?
Sure. The other interesting thing is, whereas with social media, we woke up to the dangers of social networks far too late. I mean, the kind of gratifying thing is we've been worrying about AI right from the start. I sometimes think there are more AI ethics institutes than there are AI institutes. I'm partly responsible. I did the big interview with Stephen Hawking in 2014, where he said AI will kill us all and make us obsolete. So I don't think we're not worrying enough about it. Sometimes we're worried about the wrong things, which is, it's about to kill us all, when actually what is more worrying is algorithmic bias and those kind of issues.
Well, exactly. Worrying about whether it rejects your mortgage application or, rejects your parole application is much more serious than is it becoming sentient or
not. Indeed. Well, let me take a couple of questions from the audience, because there are lots of them. Luke asks, how do you see the UK being able to contribute to or shaping competition policy and regulatory policies more generally, given the fact that big tech companies are in effect beyond one national regulatory structure? And will Brexit make this even more difficult? I think that's one for both of you.
I can start. I was at a conference at the CMA yesterday, where much of the conversation was about how well regulators are coordinating with each other over these issues. The legislation takes different shape in each country because the laws, the statutes are obviously different, but there is a lot of cooperation. And at the moment, at any rate, a kind of common view among regulators about what needs doing. And the UK is in a good position because the work the CMA has done has been terrific. Last week, they published a report on mobile phone ecosystems, the operating systems on mobile phones, which is a terrific piece of analysis that everybody in other countries has picked up.
Rory.
I should say, Diane's got an interest to declare here. She has done some work for the CMA, and we've also got a son who works for the CMA, but I'm completely objective. I mean, the slightly bizarre thing is Brexit has been great for the CMA. It's given it a more power, bigger role, and it seems to be doing some really interesting work, which is more widely admired. But and it's made some waves. I think it's the one holding up Facebook's acquisition of a little firm called Giphy, whereas every other regulator around the world has let it through. So we are making waves.
Question specifically for you, Rory, from an anonymous attendee. How do you think Twitter will change if Elon Musk takes it over? And I gather Musk is addressing the entire staff of Twitter.
He's doing an all-staff meeting. God,
all-staff meeting today. And I would just like to add to that, actually, because in the book you recall the heady early days of your use of Twitter, which is hard to remember for many of us whose experience of Twitter is often akin to sticking one's head in a sewer. So maybe you could also say a bit about what the initial promise was and how things have gone wrong.
Well, I loved Twitter. I got asked by the Today programme to do a piece about this new thing called social media in 2007. And as part of it, I joined everything that was there. I remember John Humphreys introducing the piece by talking about something called FacePack. I don't think he quite got the idea. But I joined Twitter at a time when everybody thought it was really silly. And why would you want to tell people that you just had a cappuccino? But what very rapidly happened was the London tech community, which is quite a small community, suddenly transferred from Facebook to Twitter about Christmas 2007. And for a while, it was a great little club. And as a journalist, it was brilliant because it became one sort of message board and alert system. I remember ringing the news desk one morning and saying, there's been an earthquake in China, because I'd not heard it on the radio. And they said, no, there hasn't. We'd have heard that on Reuters by now. And I said, well, it's on Twitter. Somebody's tweeted it. And half an hour later, it appeared on Reuters. And I got kudos that way. And one quickly developed a kind of, just as Tim Berners-Lee said, I don't know what people say, why people complain about the web. My experience is good because it depends who you follow. For years, and still the case to some extent, I've had a very valuable experience and still do, and find it a very good way of both publicizing what I do and finding stuff out. As to what Elon Musk will do to it, I've got to be careful here. I mean, I'm increasingly biased against Musk. I interviewed him 5-6 years ago and thought he was great and great copy, but also slightly bonkers. I wrote a piece about him with the headline, Elon Musk bonkers but brilliant, which the PR guy said was disrespectful. And I said, betrayed a different view of the word bonkers. He's got more bonkers ever since. And he's obviously done this on a whim without, as far as I can see, any great plan, and seems to want to get out of it because he's obviously overpaid. And hasn't got any very coherent way of expressing what he wants to do in terms of moderation. He's got a very simplistic way of saying, let free speech thrive. Yeah. And I think he's probably just beginning to get to grips with what a nightmare it would be to own if he had to do something about it. So, there's no good way, because if he wins, he may cause it damage. If he withdraws, then the stock price will plummet, and because there doesn't seem to be anybody else who wants to pay that much for it.
Mm. Diane, you're a pretty active user still of Twitter.
Yes, I was a couple of years after Rory. He finally encouraged me into it. I still find it quite positive. Follow economists. Econ Twitter is generally quite a civil place, and if people annoy me, I unfollow them or block them. So you can obviously shape it yourself. I think you have to be quite disciplined, not only in not using it too much, but also in not tweeting. You don't have to comment on everything is a key lesson to learn, I find.
Some of that's aimed at me, I can tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the moral is the mute button is your friend in all things. Question from Anna Hunter that maybe both of you can tackle. Should we have digital rights? Can you comment on bias, particularly against women, in the development and delivery of digital services? How important is fairness and social justice in the digital world? It's
just as important in the digital world as in the offline world. I suppose the digital angle to this is the very male-dominated character of both the computer science industry, machine learning, AI, and Silicon Valley itself. So this whole tech bro phenomenon. And there have been some quite well-publicized cases of women and people of color leaving or being squeezed out of some of the big tech companies. So I think there is a real problem. And it's in a way a similar problem to the one about the lack of diversity in economics, where the kind of social makeup of economics isn't dissimilar from computer science or from Silicon Valley. It's affluent people who really have no idea how lots of their fellow citizens live. And it's even worse. I know economists are quite powerful in policy and have a lot of responsibility. The people devising these digital devices and services have such power over our lives and are slow, I think, to understand what their social impacts have been and what their responsibilities might be. And I suppose data bias we understand now, but we understand much less well the data that's not there. We've all got these great transport apps that help us get around, and that provides a lot of data about the journeys that are made. But what about the journeys that are not made but would be really valuable, about the services that we ought to be running between small towns and their neighbouring cities? So there's a lot to worry about, and I agree with the sentiment. I would extend it beyond women to all kinds of non-socially advantaged groups.
And the cryptocurrency world, which I've become slightly obsessed by because I rather detest it, is particularly bad from this point of view. It's
it's taking a nosedive this
yeah,
week.
yeah, which I've got to confess I'm rather enjoying, but that is rife with it's a very, very male, rather primary coloured in attitudes world.
Don't you have some Bitcoin still, Rory?
I've got so little that it's not even worth selling. I've got about $2 worth now.
A question from Etta aimed at both of you. Can we do more to introduce digital literacy, and in particular the ability to interpret information in our school curriculums at a much earlier stage?
Well, I mean, that's something that I've written about and followed quite a lot. It depends what you mean by digital literacy, of course. There's been a revolution in the teaching of computing in schools over the last decade, which has had its good and bad sides. So about 10 years ago, it was recognized that the main way children learn about these matters was a subject called ICT, which was widely derided as being nothing more than learning how to use Microsoft Office. And that has been wiped out of the curriculum and successfully, in some ways, replaced by something called computer science, which is a far more rigorous exam. The trouble is there's been unintended consequences, whereas ICT was a subject which, however good or bad it was, reached quite a large part of the school population, and 40% of entrants were girls. Computer science is seen as hard. Not many kids go for it, and only 20% of the entrants are girls. So there is a problem there. And there is an argument that ICT should have been retained as a way of teaching that basic digital literacy. I mean, I think what we're actually talking about here may be a subject that was incredibly derided a few years ago, but which now looks rather important, which is media studies, because that's kind of what we need to teach people now, to understand, for instance, the difference between a story that pops up on Facebook and a story in a respectable news source like the Financial Times or the BBC.
Isn't it even broader than that? Isn't it critical thinking? Being able to understand whether a number is a big number or a small number, and is it plausible? That sort of literacy.
Yeah, but that's a whole different ballgame.
There's a question specifically from an anonymous attendee, Rory, on health tech. Health tech is vital and it could make a big difference. So much research is happening in this area, but will it be affordable, and can and must governments support it?
Well, a lot of what's happening, and I've been following what's happening in the NHS, or writing about something today, is not expensive technology. It's certainly our health service has gone down a sort of split track of getting quite excited about complicated, expensive stuff like AI, and not excited about quite simple stuff. I wrote a piece recently. There's a drive to get a register, for instance, of every medical device that's put in somebody, because there have been a number of recent scandals where, for instance, something called vaginal mesh, turned out to be very harmful, and they could not identify who'd got this. And the answer turns out to be to have barcodes on things and scan them before they're put in people. It's not complicated technology. It's technology which is cheap and which is used in every supermarket by every supermarket worker. But the NHS finds it quite difficult to get to grips with that. So there are some very simple advances in health tech which could make a big difference, which is not expensive.
The other example you had was mapping the inside of the hospital, getting lost to the scanning unit.
Yeah, I wrote something about that the other day, on my way to an MRI scan and getting completely lost. But I eventually concluded that technology, which I always think is the answer, was not the answer. You didn't want people wandering around looking at Google Street View in the hospital. You wanted people, volunteers, with badges saying, "Ask me if you're lost." And somebody actually wrote to me after a piece I wrote about that in the Radio Times, saying that's what they were a volunteer at, I think, the Royal Free Hospital, and that's exactly what they did. Sometimes technology is not the answer.
I think it was the founder of the NHS, Aaron Bevan, who said socialism is the language of priorities. Sometimes we need to get our priorities straight. Diane, there's a question here for you, specifically from another anonymous attendee. I'm very struck by the calculation of how much time is spent on devices, up to a day a week. Isn't that the answer to why we have lower productivity? We're all wasting our time on social media.
We don't have a good idea about how much, how much that online time is frittering around on social media versus doing useful things. And some of the stuff that we do on our devices is, productive, saving time by being able to make journeys faster or accessing useful information for work. There is some new data coming out of the Office for National Statistics that starts to break down what we do with our online time, which will help give some insights into that. But it's a fair question. The flatlining of productivity coincides almost perfectly with the always-on smartphone revolution.
Yeah.
And so I think it's worth looking at, and it's maybe partly real effects. It may be partly that we're not measuring things properly. Definitely something that we have to understand. But low productivity has many, many causes, and that would only be one of them, I think.
I mean, this is a particular preoccupation at the moment, particularly in this country, Diane. I mean, could you just say a bit, this is perhaps tangential, but it's worth getting you to say a bit about it, because it has such political resonance right now, why British productivity is so dire compared to some of our neighbours and economies of a similar size?
Some of the reasons are well known and long-standing. Access to finance for growing businesses, been a problem since the 1930s, which we haven't fixed. Low levels of skills, particularly below university level, vocational skills and technical skills. That's been a problem forever, and we haven't fixed it. And in fact, on the contrary, that kind of skills policy has had multiple policy changes and upheavals over time and been squeezed of funds. And the number of places in FE and apprenticeships has been going down over time. So the problem isn't an economic one, it's a political and policy one. Why, when we know these things are long-standing problems, have they been so resistant to being fixed? Then there's a puzzle about how organizations use new technologies well to improve productivity, and only some businesses are doing it well, and only some bits of the public sector are doing it well. And to use digital tools and data, you have to change the way you run the business. And that reorganization is difficult and costly. So that's happening very slowly. And there are some just genuine puzzles. A piece of work I did recently with a colleague looked at which sectors of the economy contributed most to the slowdown in productivity post-2008. Turns out to be the ones that we think are success stories. It's the high value auto manufacture, pharmaceuticals, software, telecommunications. That they're high value, the jobs are good, but they have contributed the most to the slowdown in productivity. We don't really understand why.
Rory, Diane mentioned that one of the problems the British economy suffers from is funding for small businesses and startups. Is this an area where there are lessons to be learned from Silicon Valley, where you've spent a lot of time in the venture capital model there?
Well, it struck me as Diane was talking about that everywhere you go around the world, they say, why can't we be more like Silicon Valley, including parts of the United States? And actually, the figures for Europe that I'm always quoted whenever we talk about this is that London gets twice as much venture capital as any other place in Europe. So we're not doing that bad, although there's always a huge contrast between the amount of capital available here and there. I remember writing about Uber versus Halo in the early days. I don't know if people remember, but there was a kind of taxi app called Halo. There was a great deal of excitement about it in the UK, and it raised $150 million in venture capital backing. And we thought, that is amazing. But it was up against Uber, which eventually raised something like $7 or $8 billion, as far as I remember. And that was only going to end one way. So we've done better, but like everybody else, we haven't got the investment infrastructure to match Silicon Valley.
Rory, since you mentioned Uber, do you think it's over for Uber? Do you think it will ever, as the CEO recently said, be able to show us the money?
Well, not according to my personal experience, because there was a week recently when I was in the West End 4 nights in a row and could not get an Uber any time. It basically seems to be shutting down effectively. It's a very interesting example of a company which went down that typical Silicon Valley route of just growth at all costs. And you thought, well, it worked for Facebook, it worked for Amazon, always putting growth in front of revenue or certainly profits. But it seems to have stopped working for them. I noticed, I think the chief executive today has said the days of growth at all costs are over for Uber. So it's going to be a quieter, possibly declining company.
Do you think that's true of new startups, Rory? Has that just throw money at it model had its day?
Well, I mean, that's massively changed in the last 3 months. I mean, the valuations got incredibly ridiculous. I mean, the most ridiculous valuation of all is Tesla, which is fantasy thinking. I mean, it's literally valued at something like, I looked at the other day, 20 times GM or Ford is worth more than the rest of the car industry combined. And that sort of spoke of a time of low interest rates and basically a kind of manic attitude that was completely divorced from reality in valuations. And that I think has stopped. But I think there will still be startups that rightly say, grow fast, worry about revenue later, and most of them will fail, but one of them will be the next big thing.
We have got time, I think, for one last question, and it's from Luke, who asks, this is for both of you, if you could change one thing in big tech and the digital economy, what would it be? Diane, maybe you want to tackle that first.
I would tackle the way we think about data. And we would stop thinking about it as a piece of property to be owned by the companies that make you click the box. And we would start thinking about it as, if you like, a public asset. And we'd think about it in terms of who has permission to access data for what purpose. And that would make the data economy much more like the offline economy, where we don't mind people knowing very personal things about us, as long as they're the right people, our doctor about our health or our bank manager about our finances. And that's the kind of world I would like us to get to.
If we're looking for big things, I suppose I'd want us to become less dependent on the advertising business model, which creates many of those harms that Diane has been talking about, that we discussed earlier. More businesses that could grow at a sensible pace. I'd love to see a model for journalism that didn't depend on advertising and that was more sustainable and rewarded accurate information as opposed to inaccurate opinion.
Well, the FT has a subscription-led business model, and we've passed 1 million global subscribers last year.
Marvellous too. It's a marvellous product.
Can I mention the Manchester Mill, which is a local startup subscription,
very good example,
which is also fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the evisceration of local newspapers has really contributed to the degradation of the public sphere over the last 10 or 20 years in the US as well as the UK. So that's very glad you mentioned them, Diane. And just to end, Rory, in the last couple of minutes, we have, you remain fundamentally an optimist about the potential of digital technology, arguably even the emancipatory potential of this technology.
I do. From my point of view, people often ask, students often ask you about how you got into journalism and how they should get into journalism. And I look back, and in some ways there were far more opportunities because there were big training schemes. But in other ways, it was very regimented and unimaginative, a path people took. Nowadays, you don't need to own a television studio to be a broadcaster. You don't need to own a newspaper to be a writer. That has been an incredible emancipation. We've seen this explosion of creativity. Even if, I feel I'm a bit old for TikTok, I'm extraordinarily impressed by colleagues who have found that a sort of route to self-expression. So that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic, despite the fact that an explosion of content doesn't always mean quality content, but it certainly has introduced new voices to areas like journalism and filmmaking, which can only be a good thing.
Well, this is the moment, if we were in a room together, where I'd ask the audience to join me in a round of applause to thank Diane and Rory. That round of applause will have to be virtual. I think my colleagues will look at me slightly askance if I start applauding now. Instead, I'm going to say that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after June the 24th. And you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Diane and Rory's books, Cogs and Monsters and Always On, they will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And for more information on book sales, please see the festival website or head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. And we hope you'll continue to be engaged with the Festival of Ideas, and check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full details of all the events in the festival programme. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag #YorkIdeas. And I'd like to end by thanking again Rory and Diane for a really fascinating and rich discussion. Thanks, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.
Bye.